Welcome to Primarily 2020, the podcast all about the 2020 Democratic primary. I'm your host, Karin Robinson. This week, I'm delighted to welcome Nicky Woolf, the editor of the new Statesman America, to the podcast. Nicky and I recorded a very long and delightfully wide-ranging conversation about a whole array of topics, including the similarity between Trump and newly elected, elected by Conservative Party members anyway, UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson, the overall trajectory of the Democratic primary, Robert Mueller's testimony in front of Congress this week and the political implications of that for Democrats. We discussed reports that Democrats could win the popular vote by up to 5 million votes and still lose the Electoral College. There's been some new analysis that's come out this week that has a lot of us scratching our heads with concern. So we talk about that and how realistic a possibility that is. We talk about everything from Susan Collins' declining poll numbers in Maine and the possibility that she might not even run for re-election. We talk about why Stacey Abrams isn't running for Senate. We talk about why Beto O'Rourke isn't running for Senate, why nobody wants to be a senator these days, and a lot more. So stay tuned for what I thought was a very interesting and wide-ranging conversation. But before we do that, I just wanted to remind my listeners that the podcast, Primarily 2020, now has its own YouTube channel. I've launched it as a trial. I'm not sure if I'll carry it on or not, but if I get a lot of subscribers and people tell me that they find it valuable, I will carry on. So the last couple of weeks of episodes are already live, and this episode will be live on the YouTube channel shortly. So if you just search for Primarily 2020 in YouTube and subscribe if you are interested, or if that is not your preferred podcast platform, then just let me know that, and I will bear that in mind as I make my decision whether to carry on. Right, without further ado, over to Nicky Woolf. So today I want to welcome on the podcast Nicky Woolf, who is the editor of the new Statesman America. Thank you for coming on, Nicky.
Thanks for having me.
So first and foremost, New Statesman America is a relatively new publication in the media landscape. So for the benefit of all my listeners, what is it and what do you do there?
Yes, that's correct. So I'm the editor. We launched last summer. We're a sister publication to the New Statesman, which is Britain's premier progressive politics and current affairs magazine, which recently celebrated our centenary in the UK. So we've been around a fair while.
So 100 years here in the UK. And for those of us who are US expats living in the UK, you probably have heard of the New Statesman. For my American friends, you either will have heard of it or already have heard of it. And Nicky's going to make sure that happens.
Yeah, that's the plan.
That's the plan. Good luck with that. So I think I was just really interested to talk to you today for a number of reasons, but one of which is because you have a perspective that's kind of the reverse of mine in that you cover US politics as a Brit. I am an American person living in the UK, always trying to explain American politics to British people who have many questions. So I was just curious to start off with kind of, because your audience that you talk to is mostly American, but you've also got a history of also talking about US politics to British and kind of sort of explaining each side to the other. Is that true? And what is that like for you?
Yeah, well, it's sort of interesting. I mean, especially as obviously Britain has just got a new prime minister, which a lot of people are describing as Trumpian, Trump-esque. I think, including Trump himself, has called
Britain Trump. He said.
Yeah, so there's a lot of people now sort of saying, well, all right, what are we going to be in for? And a lot of lessons that can be kind of learned transatlantically. I think it's to a certain extent, I think the Anglophone world, because it's exposed to the same internet, the same culture, the same TV programs. My dad watches The Daily Show in London, that sort of thing. So there's a lot of kind of cross the pond arbitrage that can be done.
How many times have British people asked you to explain the Electoral College?
Quite a few.
Are you able to explain it to them?
Well, I mean, actually quite a lot of Americans also, I think have, especially after 2016, there've been, I think, was this the second election that there's been in which the popular vote winner
It's
Uh,
actually the fourth such election in American history, but the second in the last 20 years because George W. Bush was also elected without a popular vote. Not that it's a sore spot or anything.
yeah. Then again, Britain is seeing there, and I'm going to reveal my political proclivities here, but is seeing the dangers with more specifically direct democracy, in this case, full national referenda. So
Yeah.
there's problems with all electoral
So
systems.
referendums don't work so much. Representative democracy has its flaws. What does
Yeah.
work? What is it
Um,
they say? It's the best of all. It's the worst possible system except for all the others.
yeah, and I think that's probably still true. I am ultimately still a believer in the systems of representative democracy. Maybe Silicon Valley will find a way to have us all effectively governed by a computer soon.
Oh, I'm not sure that sounds good.
Yeah, no, Silicon Valley does not have a sterling track record, and
Yeah.
move
I mean,
fast and break things doesn't sound really good for a government computer.
in fact, we may already be there. I mean, there's a serious question to which extent we are governed by algorithms right now. Certainly in the last election, there was some impact of that in 2016.
It's really difficult to see how the Trump phenomenon or the Brexit phenomenon happens without Facebook or Twitter being a factor.
Yeah. Well, and so let's come on to that because we've kind of suggested repeatedly already in this conversation that there are some kind of parallels between British political system or the British political situation in which we find ourselves and the American political situation in which we find ourselves for the calamities happening on either side of our respective ocean.
Yeah.
Um, you mentioned the fact that Boris Johnson Trump thinks he's Trumpian. Does Boris Johnson think he's Trumpian?
I don't think so, and I kind of think he probably winces every time Trump makes that comparison because, as was pointed out by there was a protest group during Trump's UK visit that projected his side-by-side approval ratings versus he and President Obama. I think Obama was something like 76, and Trump's approval rating in the UK is around 20, 21. So I don't think Boris is particularly over the moon about being too closely associated with Donald Trump. Um, then again, there's the obvious comparison, which is that they both have extremely strange hair. Um,
Although, as I pointed out to my uncle emailed me from America to say, do they have the same hairdresser? And I had to say they're kind of the opposite hair because
yeah,
Boris Johnson famously likes to ruffle his hair up so it looks really scruffy. Donald Trump is terrified of a strong breeze because it's going to mess up his hair and reveal the fact that he's bald underneath a very sad comb over.
yeah, and it's under very kind of tight military grade control. There was a fascinating piece. I can't remember. I'm going to not try and risk attributing it. So I'll send it to the wrong place. But there
A
was
person wrote a thing.
yeah, about exactly how many. I think it was 3 cans of hairspray a day he gets through in order to keep that thing under control.
Quite
Because
a
I don't
lot.
think Boris had ever seen a can of hairspray.
But I mean, on a more serious note, though, although Boris Johnson does not, I agree with you, probably doesn't see himself as Trumpian. The From observing him, I have noticed his one thing he seems to have in common with Trump is a certain lack of political ideology in the, like a certain preference for his own personal self-interest over any consistent political ideology. I say that because, he has made sort of vaguely positive statements about Trump. And in 2008, he was very pro-Obama. And then he decided at some point that he was not going to be pro-Obama anymore. And then he started making kind of very negative statements about Obama and indeed kind of seemed to be suggesting questions about Obama's parentage and so forth. And he just seems to be all over the map. And it's not clear in its very Trumpian way. It's not clear that he has a consistent set of ideologies necessarily. Or do you think I'm wrong about that?
No, I think the key thing they share outside of the kind of superficialities of their kind of performative styles is political opportunism. Where it slightly falls down is I think Trump, and this came out in the Mueller report, described his 2016 campaign as the biggest infomercial ever made. I think whereas Boris has obviously been dreaming about nothing else than arriving in number 10 Downing Street for his whole life, Trump, I think, saw running for president as something which he expected to lose and which would help raise his stature for his business interests. So I think the ambitions are slightly different in that sense.
Yeah.
But certainly they have arrived both at this extremely hardcore kind of populist nationalist ideology as an expedient way of activating a political base. I think that's the kind of core comparison.
So I think the other thing that's interesting to look at is on the other side, the opposition to each is quite different. I think you'd have to say. So in Britain, one of the problems that we have right now is politically, Labour, which had been the clear opposition party for a lot of years, Labour, the Conservatives, and the Liberal Democrats and the Brexit Party are now all polling at about 20%. So there isn't really an opposition. So in the
Yeah.
US, that's very different because we remain very polarized around two centers. How do you see that kind of different partisan polity bearing out across the two countries?
So it's worth saying that I think that while Boris Johnson's election to me it implies that there will almost certainly have to be a general election, probably presumably before the October 31st deadline, because and before then, I think the challenge for Boris is that he has to neutralize Nigel Farage and the Brexit Party. And whereas in America, because elections are constitutionally on a time limit, everyone has, and by everyone I mean the two political parties have a lot more structure around how they organize. That said, there is a one particular very interesting congressman who quit the Republican Party a couple of weeks ago, called Justin Amash. She was the only Republican to come out after the Mueller report to be in favor of impeachment and then quit the party. My suspicion is that he plans to run on the Libertarian Party ticket for president, with the hopes of pulling off quite a large contingent of anti-Trump Republicans. If he was to do that, and there is a history of kind of third-party politicians, Ralph Nader immediately springs to mind, but also people blamed kind of Jill Stein for pulling votes away from Hillary Clinton in 2016. So there is not quite to the same extent as the kind of wild polling in the UK is showing, but there is more of a plurality in the American electorate than it sort of looks like on the surface. That said, the British situation is so fascinating because it's almost unprecedented for the two major parties to be in some polls third and fourth place to two other parties. How exactly that all plays out, I think to a certain extent, and the other thing I wanted to say a little bit is that there are, while the parallels between Boris and Trump are we talked about, I think there are also some parallels to be made between Jeremy Corbyn and Trump. He is also kind of pushing a few of those nationalist buttons. He's also an isolationist, believes in kind of not in one of the few things I think Trump actually does believe is in not entangling American foreign wars overseas. That's why he's been so resistant with Jordan and Iran. But also,
I mean, it's basically isolationism and racism. That's the Trumpian philosophy. And Corbyn,
isolationism, then arguably there's certainly an anti-Semitism problem within the Labour Party at the moment. It's not kind of with Trump, it's not a bug, it's a feature. With the Labour Party, I'm slightly.
We've sort of accidentally stumbled into, oops, now we're associated with lots of anti-Semites. How'd that happen?
Yeah, and then a lack of dealing with it in a sort of quick and effective way, which has not been a great look. But they also have kind of extremely hyper partisan media outriders. You've got the kind of squawk boxes and the Canaries in England, and I'm going to get tweets for that, and so are you now. But and you've got Momentum as an organization, which is sort of like the MAGA crowd of the really hardcore kind of volunteer base. So I think there are parallels to be drawn in that direction too.
Yeah, I think that the left in America is interesting because, we talk about the organizations like Momentum and so forth. There is a lot of left-leaning progressive activism organizations in the US. And there isn't one, though, that I think plays specifically a Momentum type role, unless it's the Bernie Sanders Our Revolution group. There isn't one that has that kind of dominance of the landscape, though, of a particular progressive wing, as far as I can see, unless you think there is.
Well, what we're in obviously at the moment is the Democratic primary race, and there's such a kind of a wide range within the Democratic Party that it could almost be compared to, there's the Lib Dem, as it were, wing of the Democratic Party, and then there's the much further to the left. So on one side you've got kind of
there's like the Green Party wing.
Yeah, you've got people who are running on an environmentalist platform. You've got people like Joe Biden who are running on centrism and reaching out across the aisle, and then you've got people like, especially Bernie Sanders, who's very much kind of the hard left. He's not even a Democratic Party member. Technically, he follows the whip in the Senate, but he's not a member of the party. And there's this kind of battle for the soul of the Democratic Party going on right now, and to a certain extent, whichever side wins, they're going to have. And this was the same problem in the 2016 election. And I was working for The Guardian during the 2016 election, following Bernie around on the campaign trail and talking to a lot of people at his rallies who were saying, we love Bernie for this kind of same isolationist, putting, they didn't actually say kind of America first in so many words, but there were echoes of that. And a lot of them were saying, if Bernie doesn't win, and it's the anti-establishment feeling as well. They were saying if Bernie doesn't win, we're going to vote for Trump because he is the other anti-establishment candidate. He's the one that will shake it up.
I mean, Bernie was running against the party in 2016, and he's still trying to play that playbook, and it doesn't seem to be working. My perception is, isn't working as well for him this time around, perhaps because there are more people in a similar territory, or because the party is more aligned in their determination to get Trump out. Is that what do you think is going on with Bernie in this cycle?
I think there's quite a lot of that. It's hard to foment anti-establishment feeling when you're the party in opposition, and to a certain extent, the establishment is so visibly Trump, and everyone's running against that. But also, I think Elizabeth Warren, who I think is just a kind of a more complete package with a lot of the same ideals as Bernie, but a lot more detailed plans as to exactly how she'd execute them, and just as much of a claim to him. Just as much of a claim as Bernie to have been outside the establishment, but also, you see her on the stump, and she's much more energized. She's much more, she's frankly much better at it. And so what you've been seeing is sort of Bernie sort of slowly losing 1 or 2 points, as the weeks go on, and Warren sort of steadily gaining. She had a very good debate in the first Democratic debates. And Kamala Harris also had an extremely good debate, but she's very much on the more kind of centrist, less sort of revolutionary side of the party. But Warren isn't framing it as this kind of revolution. She's just saying this is how American government should be. It should be better for everyone, right? But it doesn't have to be. We don't have to be, rioting in the streets for it.
So you mentioned Elizabeth Warren, which is absolutely correct, has been steadily gaining in the polls, which has been interesting. It hasn't been any one surge moment. It's been a sort of steady growth in her support, which seems to be because she's resonating really well when she goes out and gives those big speeches, when she does rallies, lots of voter contact in the kind of retail politics sense in the early states. Who else on the campaign trail has been perhaps exceeding expectations or perhaps not meeting up to expectations?
So the big surprise has been that Pete Buttigieg, who is the mayor of South Bend, Indiana, so kind of a small town mayor, not nearly as high national profile, certainly at the beginning of the campaign as the kind of big time senators also in the race and some of the governors. He had a very quick bump. He had a few very viral moments. And the general feeling was that, this happens in a campaign, someone has a bump and then they slightly disappear again when people get to, know them a bit more and when other people have them. But Buttigieg has managed to turn that bump into a reasonably steady rise to the point where he's maybe not in. So at the moment, the Democratic primary has kind of 4 distinctly top tier candidates. It's Joe Biden, Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders, and Kamala Harris.
Yep.
They're almost level pegging it in the polls. 2 of them, Biden and Bernie, have been slightly trending down. 2 of them, Harris and Warren, trending upwards, but largely they're kind of around, sort of about even now. Buttigieg is sort of just behind them in a way that I don't think anyone quite expected him to last this long and to be this much of a a force in the campaign. His last quarter fundraising numbers, he raised $24 million, which is an extraordinary amount for
Yeah, he
a
was the
small.
top. He was the top fundraising candidate in quarter two, which was
Yeah,
like people expected him to raise a lot of money, but I don't think people expected him to be at the top. He's not at the top of the polls. He's kind of fourth or fifth in the polls, depending on which data you're looking at. So he's clearly doing something right, and so his fundraising has been great. His media performance has been very great, as you rightly
yeah.
say. He compelled himself into the forefront of the race by a series of very good media experiences. Have you seen him on the campaign trail? Have you been able to watch him at rallies or interacting with voters? I'm curious to know how that grassroots piece is working.
So I haven't been to any Buttigieg events yet, but sort of watching him sort of televised addresses and watching him interact with, I mean, there's moments where I mean, he's clearly just an extraordinarily smart person. There was one moment where he got asked a question by a TV crew from a Norwegian TV station and just dropped immediately into fluent Norwegian.
Like we all would have, obviously.
Yeah, no, and there's loads of he's clearly very charming. He's very good on the stump. And then in the debate there was so the second of the two debates had two very interesting moments. One was when Kamala Harris absolutely just sort of eviscerated Joe Biden over his working with pro-segregationist senators, and Joe Biden's record on this is a huge vulnerability in his campaign, and nobody thinks that so far he's been dealing with it particularly well. His apologies seem to have fallen flat and been insincere. His not having a prepared answer to that question in the debate, which he must have known to a certain extent was coming, and if no one around him was telling him that he was going to have a really good answer for that,
It was
you know,
not great.
it was not great. No,
It
but
wasn't even just not having the answer. It was he kind of there was a moment where he ran out of time. He was trying to stumble to see how to answer it, and then technically he ran out of time. But every other candidate in the debate had all been briefed to keep talking past their time, so they look like they have more to say. And he just kind of stopped and went, "Well, I'm out of time." It was like,
yeah,
oh,
and
oh that's not good.
it was yeah, that whole moment was pretty disastrous for him, and then that stood in kind of stark contrast to Buttigieg got an incredibly difficult question, which was,
Yeah.
you have said that police forces should be representative of the communities they're policing. In your city, which is 26% African American, your police force is only 6%. How do you square that? And he gave this incredibly honest answer, which started, you know what, we just couldn't get it done.
Yeah.
And here are the systemic, deep reasons we couldn't get it done. And here's what that would mean for my presidency. And it was in exactly the way that Biden failed to do. It was to take the attack coming and kind of jujitsu it around into a real kind of winner of an answer. And it was just an extremely impressive moment. He was, it was almost moving in a way.
It was very beautifully handled on his part, but I think it probably hasn't completely solved his problem, because I think his electoral problem is who are the voters that he can win. To win the Democratic primary, you need to have a pretty diverse coalition. You need to have pretty strong support from specifically African American voters if you want to eventually succeed in the Democratic primary. Buttigieg, most of the support he has is from white voters, and specifically educated white voters, basically people like me. He is exactly in the me demographic, person with postgraduate degree, cosmopolitan, white voter, who has a great deal of empathy for the minority experience, but is not myself, Black or minority.
Right.
And I think that's Pete Buttigieg in a nutshell. He needs to find a way to break out of that and tell a story to kind of the rest of the demographic. And I think he hasn't quite found the way that he's going to grow past where he is. So maybe he's reached a plateau, or maybe he will find a way of talking about his story in a way that can broaden out his coalition a little bit.
Right, and it's worth mentioning that interestingly, for the received wisdom in American politics for a very long time has been that if you're a lawyer, if you have a legal career running for high office, you can't be a defender because you get attacked as soft on crime. You are the cause of criminals walking free, and that received wisdom has slightly flipped on its head to the extent that Kamala Harris, who has a long history as a prosecutor in California, is facing questions about her prosecutorial record in a way that's interesting. So she's, people are saying, well, there's quite a lot of people in California, a lot of people of color behind bars because of Harris's time as a prosecutor, and so it's worth mentioning that despite the attack line on the whole question of the kind of busing era in the Senate, one of the candidates with reasonably strong support in the African American community is still Joe Biden.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And African American voters do not necessarily comply with people's stereotypes of them. They do tend to like sort of more moderate establishment Democrat candidates that they feel like they can trust to do what's needed rather than necessarily looking for the most progressive candidate.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think that's definitely the case. The other thing that's going to be different about this primary, though, is the rule changes and the schedule changes. So the rule changes mean that there's no more winner-take-all primaries. That was the kind of Bernie reforms that were demanded. That's kind of a wild card. No one really knows what that's going to mean. So it's entirely possible that this primary, in a way that kind of in primaries past, people would be dropping out if they hadn't kind of made it, will now kind of hang on to the convention in order to leverage the few delegates they get. And so on the one hand, that means that the primary is going to be quite scrappy, probably all the way through. On the other hand, it means that candidates are more incentivized to be nicer to each other because at some point, once it gets to the convention, they're going to need each other's delegates. And then the schedule changes is now California is much earlier in the primary schedule than it has been before. And so a lot of candidates, the sort of Beto O'Rourke type candidates whose approach has been the kind of Iowa retail politics of standing on the diner countertops and doing all that kind of stuff, which in previous primaries, Iowa is where you get your momentum from. This time, early voting in California opens the same day as the Iowa caucuses, so there will be exit polls from California the same time Iowa results are coming out. So it's entirely possible that a candidate like Kamala Harris, who might not do so well in Iowa, could point to California and say, well, look, I'm polling here. California is, dozens of times larger than Iowa. And that kind of changes the tactical arithmetic a little bit.
It is a really interesting one because it's a huge unknown. Everything we know about American political primaries for the past probably nearly 40, 50 years has been based upon Iowa and New Hampshire going first and then setting a template. And then you usually have a scrappy battle. Usually somebody doesn't do well in Iowa and then maybe might have a comeback in New Hampshire. And then it all falls into place fairly quickly. I mean, 2008 was the big exception to that, where Hillary and Barack Obama fought like later in the primary, but still the trajectory of the race became very clear after Ohio. The day after Ohio, everything changed. Obama won the Ohio primary and the caucuses, and everybody suddenly saw that as a possibility. It actually transformed his position in South Carolina, for example, because South Carolina, which is
the primary in terms of how the kind of African American vote is going to go, right? That's the
Exactly. So Black voters who hadn't at that time necessarily believed in the possibility of a Barack Obama presidency because they just thought it was too far of a reach, suddenly they all came on board. So I'm curious to know whether there's an opportunity for like that for Kamala Harris, where maybe voters who might be doubtful of her now, does she need to do well in Iowa and New Hampshire in order to have that moment of belief from the wider community?
My guess is probably not now, because I mean, if I was advising the Harris campaign, I would say that much more important than a strong showing in Iowa and a strong showing in New Hampshire is going to be extremely difficult because that's Elizabeth Warren's home turf, and she can probably be expected to storm that primary pretty hard. Is the worry for Harris is if she doesn't do as well as predicted against Warren in California. And so if early exit polls show that she's sort of level with or behind Warren, that's kind of her main opportunity to have that momentum.
Yeah.
And so Warren versus Harris in California is probably the key question that I'm looking at in these primaries.
That will definitely be a very interesting one to watch. So, but look, like for all of this machinations right now, Joe Biden is clearly the ahead in the polls. I don't know if you could yet call him the front runner because he doesn't have a majority or close to a majority
Yeah.
of the way the votes are split, but he's got a significant
He
lead.
was 3 months ago, right?
Mm. Yeah, so he's lost a lot of support, but he still remains in the lead of the polls. So I guess my question to you is, do you think that's a phantom number? Do you think that that Biden's kind of position in the front runner is just remaining to be residual name recognition and it will erode, or do you think he has the prospect of kind of remaining the front runner right through?
I think he's certainly got the prospect. It's extremely difficult in this kind of race because it's such a long time. Like there's still what, 9 months or so, 9 or
Yeah.
10 months before primary season properly starts gearing up. That's a long time for someone like Joe Biden to have a target on their back from so many other extremely strong candidates. That said, um, a lot of the time we kind of get caught up in this sort of DC horse race bubble, and a lot of actual voters, you know, haven't aren't as keyed in to
Yeah.
the primary. And so I don't think the residual name recognition, or quite how beloved the administration he was a part of and
Yeah.
an important part of was. So I don't think it's time to discount Biden quite so early. And the other question that's the slightly uncomfortable one for me being, so my personal feeling is that I think Warren is clearly the best candidate in terms of who I would think would make the best president. So it's
Mm-hmm.
a strong field. There is a slight question. So when I first moved to America as a correspondent, I lived in Defiance County, Ohio, which is a bellwether county, and I still go back there to kind of get like a check
Defiance County.
Defiance. So Defiance
I
County
love that.
it was America's closest bellwether county for a long while. I think for 90 odd years. It never failed to pick the presidential winner in the presidential election. So I've got some good friends out there, and I was out there a few weeks ago for the 4th of July, and I was talking to them, and they were saying we held our nose and voted for Trump. He's clearly a bad guy, but we're small business owners. We don't want our taxes to go up, and we'd be very worried by these candidates that have a reputation of being kind of, on the socialist end of the spectrum. And they were effectively saying that, like, if the Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Elizabeth Warren wing is in control of the party, they would hold their noses and vote for Trump again. But they were saying that they would consider voting for a Joe Biden candidacy.
Yeah.
And that's a worrying fact for a lot of Democrats. And so there's something, much as I love Elizabeth Warren, there's something that troublingly reminds me of the 1972 election, where the Democrats went for the idealistic, the kind of good person, George McGovern, and just as we all know, just completely failed to win over.
It did not work.
It didn't work, right? And obviously, there's a lot has changed in how politics is done between then and now. Obviously, Elizabeth Warren isn't literally George McGovern, and McGovern made some quite colossal personal mistakes during that campaign that a Warren candidacy might not do. But she certainly has, in terms of winning the primary by being the candidate of the excited left base, makes the pivot that she would, I think, need to make in the general election to win and appeal to kind of middle American voters is quite a difficult maneuver to pull off. Now, I think if anyone can, it's probably Elizabeth Warren, but that is still something to be slightly worried about.
I think the challenge that you articulate is fundamentally the key challenge of the Democratic primary and the election, right? It's Democrats are extremely motivated. They are horrified and desperately want Trump not to be president anymore by any means necessary. They would ideally, the party itself has had an awakening, right? It's probably itself moved to a more progressive direction. It's certainly become more diverse. It's certainly become more open in terms of the open-closed dichotomy. And Elizabeth Warren is a great fit for them ideologically, but whether or not she's electable, or whether kind of the most electable candidate under those circumstances looks the same as a most electable candidate in previous elections is an open question. But
Yeah.
I kind of almost feel like that's the main debate we're having is, yeah, there's policy conversations, but people are looking at these candidates going, which one is going to win against Donald Trump? Which is the person that's the best fit between what I care about and will be president as soon as possible. And it feels like it's kind of baked into the conversation that we're having. And so we're having all these debates about what electability means and and then calling out some of the lazy assumptions about electability. It's not necessarily the
I
case
think
that a
there's a
white
lot of
male.
misogyny in the electability question. This idea that is a woman electable is itself a sexist question to be asking, I think, to a
Yeah.
certain extent.
Yeah, it is.
Because
And
that's what people were saying about Barack Obama. They were saying,
yeah,
is a black candidate electable? And Obama won twice, and Hillary Clinton didn't. And she
yeah.
was supposed to be the electable candidate. She was the candidate of the Democratic Party machine. She was the safe choice. So the side I eventually come down on is what I think the Democratic Party should do is pick the candidate that we genuinely, and I say we, I'm obviously not a Democratic Party member, but pick the
We of
candidate
the left.
as president and then fight an election on that rather than
Yeah.
try and game the system.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I also think you can't second guess it too much. Like if you passionately believe in someone and think that they excite you and you enjoy what they have to say and you think that their contribution to American life is positive and you love going to their rallies, like it's weird to then think that's not electable, right? There's something in there that you're responding to that's real. So, I think to some extent we can trust that and I mean, Barack Obama won in 2008 because he was genuinely an excellent candidate. He did a great
Yeah.
job. People saw that, they responded to it, and the American voters more broadly saw it as well. So I guess it does come back to that thing of we all have that fear of what does my Republican uncle think?
Right. But the other thing, and I think the other lesson that we can take from the 2016 campaign is that, and to a certain extent, this is about changes in the polarization of the electorate, and to a certain extent, this is about technological change with kind of the rise of the importance of social media. Elections are now not about reaching out to moderates. The Democrats can entirely win in 2020, not by trying to swing people who voted for Trump, but by getting more of their base to turn up and arrive to the polls. And a lot of that is about overcoming voter suppression too.
Yeah.
But
Yeah, I mean, podcast listeners will know that a couple of weeks ago we had Rachel Bidikofer on talking about her very interesting model, a prediction model showing that partisan alignment and negative partisanship is so strong that the Democrats in her model are favored to win almost no matter who they nominate, just because the right demographic trends are in place for us, as well as the right amount of voter engagement on the part of our demographics. But then we also have an electoral college problem in that the three states that we lost in 2016 that we expected to win, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, are less diverse and less like our coalition than the rest of the country. So that is a challenge that we can't look away from.
And so that's a question that I've been banging this drum for a long while, but it's always seemed to me that the way that a candidate like Kamala Harris or Elizabeth Warren would want to go in order to address that particular problem would be to put Sherrod Brown, the incredibly popular senator from Ohio, on the bottom of the ticket, because he was reelected in 2018 in an election in which Ohio went more towards Trump than it had even in 2016. He outrun the national polls by almost double digits, just absolutely creamed his opponent.
And he's a proud left progressive.
He's a proud left progressive, but also a proper kind of unimpeachable blue collar credentials.
Yeah.
He essentially would put Ohio in the bag. Ohio in the bag basically wins the election all on its own, but he also makes Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania extremely difficult for Trump. Now, the downside to that is that that would lose Democrats a Senate seat. And this is an election in which the Senate looks like it's going to come down to an absolute razor wire, in which it might really just swing on whether or not Susan Collins holds her seat in Maine as to whether Democrats take back the Senate. and this would hand the Republicans a Senate seat to be appointed by the new Republican governor. So that's the downside to the Sherrod Brown.
I love the notion if you phrased it as, it's not this pure, but if you phrased it as a pure choice of you can have the presidency but lose the Senate. I think I know which choice Democrats would make on that, but that's a horrible choice to have to make. You mentioned Susan Collins. I don't know if you saw this week. So last week on the podcast, we talked about the fact that her poll numbers have absolutely plummeted. One of the things I saw this week was a statement from her saying she's considering whether or not she's actually even going to run for re-election, saying that there are a lot. If she didn't, that would be extraordinary, and a very, very likely Democratic pickup opportunity.
Yeah, and I think it's already a pretty likely Democratic pickup opportunity, even with her remaining in the race. I mean, if anything, because it was the Kavanaugh vote that seems to have really tanked her poll numbers, the Democrats might be almost better off running against her than against whoever the Republicans nominate to run for that seat separately. So it's going to be a really interesting race shaping up in Maine.
Yeah, a lot of action happening in Maine. So I think we've talked a lot. I do want to cover one of the other big political news stories of the week, which is that Robert Mueller finally testified in front of Congress. How did it go?
I mean, it was just as. So he had when he gave his press conference when he wound up the special counsel office, he essentially told us how this was going to go, which was, I am not going to go any further than what I've said in the report. The report speaks for itself, and that's essentially how it played out. He refused to be drawn on any hypotheticals, which he obviously was not going to do. He said, I will refer you back to the report. Back to the report dozens and dozens of times.
But he even refused to actually read from his own report because he didn't want the soundbite on camera of him reading his own words in the report he had written.
Yeah, he's extremely, extremely sensitive to any risk of becoming politicized in any way. He does not want to be, and a lot of people did read in the report that it was an impeachment referral. He does say that there is a body that can prosecute a president, and it is Congress. He is, he was never there was never any chance that he was going to be drawn by the question, would you have indicted Trump if he was not the president? He's such a kind of old school, by the books kind of guy. There was just no way he was going to allow himself to be drawn on any of those questions. But the problem is that the expectation game was misplayed by the Democrats in that people were expecting this to be some kind of triumphant moment where everyone would sort of look into the face of Mueller and he would say something that could be packaged into, yes, the president committed a crime.
Yes, the president committed impeachable offenses. I don't know what you're doing, Congress. Get on with it already. That's kind of what we were hoping for.
Yeah. There is a totally separate question, and it's another part of this kind of battle within the Democratic Party. I'm not entirely sure that I don't think Pelosi isn't a little bit right in that a lot of the polling does imply that the 2020 presidential election, the Democrats don't want to be running on a impeach Trump platform. They do better when, and this is why I think Elizabeth Warren is such a good candidate, when they're talking about issues, they're talking about healthcare, they're talking about the economy, they're talking about making people's lives better on a day-to-day basis, and sort of just not mentioning President Trump at all, and having an ongoing bitter impeachment proceeding that the president will use to excite his base and say, they're trying to steal my election, they're trying to steal the president that you voted for, might make things more difficult for them in 2020 rather than less.
But see, here's my problem with that. See, because I really struggle with this. I know that in the 2018 midterm, for example, that was exactly our strategy. It worked very well. It was focus on bread and butter issues, focus on what people care about, focus on their healthcare in particular, focus on kind of making a better life for American citizens, focus on local, kind of your understanding of your local constituencies and finding great candidates who are right for each district. And that all worked great. But the problem at the presidential level to me is that the Democratic argument is that, and I completely endorse this argument, that Trump is fundamentally unfit for the office that he holds, that he has committed egregious acts, whether they're criminal or not doesn't actually matter. He has committed egregious acts which are intolerable for the presidency, but at the same time that we're not going to do anything about that. And that just feels like we have to either say one thing or the other, right? Like we have to either say that we will use all the power at our disposal to remove what we are phrasing as, correctly in my view, a singular threat to the republic, or we need to stop saying that, because it makes us look for our voters, for the kind of engaged Democratic voters that we need to bring out in order to win this presidential election. It makes it look like there is no point in putting us into power because we appear ineffectual, would be my concern.
Yeah, and the problem is those two things are both true, and there's a risk that the Pelosi versus the squad kind of fight becomes a sort of a democratic civil war that either way that it's decided becomes a kind of electoral liability. On the other hand, there's the counter argument to that, the other way of seeing those two facts is that actually it might be reasonably smart to allow kind of Pelosi and the AOC wing to kind of play good cop, bad cop that way. And so you could almost sort of start sort of a shadow impeachment proceedings, certainly in the court of public opinion, presided over by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, while Pelosi gets to say, meantime, we're going to get some bills passed and we're going to win the 2020 election. So there's, but I don't think anyone knows how this game's out. And obviously the other thing that the main news from the Mueller report and the Mueller testimony that it sort of gets lost in the what does this mean for Trump question is, of course, that Russia comprehensively did and comprehensively still is interfering in the American political system.
And we're not doing anything about that either.
We're not doing anything about it.
Yeah.
And
which is not great.
McConnell is blocking any election security bills.
Yeah. I do want to give a shout out to Texas Congressman Will Hurd on that for being the only Republican congressperson to actually take seriously and make a public statement about the election interference aspect of Mueller's report. He did, in fact, say, this is appalling and we need to do something about it. It would be great if we would. Mitch McConnell has been very, very clear that he opposes that, taking any action that would, that would prevent Trump from getting reelected through unlawful Russian intervention. So, we need to be clear that that's what's happening.
In many ways, Trump is the second singular threat to the Republic. I would say that almost as much of a singular threat to the Republic is Mitch McConnell and has been for quite some time.
Well, Mitch McConnell is also facing a interesting competition in his Senate race because he's up for re-election, and Amy McGrath, who was a pretty compelling candidate in a House seat in Kentucky in the last race, has stepped up to run against him. There's a lot of debate about whether McConnell is actually under any threat. And it's kind of a bit of you can sort of see it both ways, because on the one hand, Kentucky is a extremely Republican state. So one of the strongest Trump voting states in the country. On the other hand, Mitch McConnell in Kentucky is very unpopular. So it feels like there is an opportunity there. I don't know if Amy McGrath is the right one to take it, but it will be interesting to watch.
And certainly if I was either organizations like Indivisible or the DSCC, I would be absolutely pouring money into that race.
Well, they kind of don't even need to, because she raised $2.5 million overnight just from putting out a good video. Like, she's a self-funding machine. She was in her House race too. So in a way, for the DSCC, I'd be saying she's the Democratic Senatorial Campaign Committee. I would be saying she's a gimme, right? You don't have to raise a lot of money for her because she'll raise a lot of money herself. Whether she wins her race or not, she's going to distract Mitch McConnell's time, money, and attention. And she doesn't have to win the race to change the national conversation about making Mitch McConnell look weak. So it kind of feels like it's a no-lose scenario for us.
Yeah. And if the Democrats go a different way than Sherrod Brown in 2020, then one possible outcome is, and again, I mean, we go back to 1972, which would be the Republicans retaining the White House, but the Democrats having both the House and the Senate. And then I think you very quickly would find that the conversation on impeachment would change because first of all, they then don't have a 2020 election to worry about, and they have both houses, so the proceedings could move extremely fast. So it's entirely possible to me that Trump would win the election, but then only remain as president for a few months after that.
And speaking of
a glimmer of hope there.
Potentially. But then speaking of scenarios, in a horrific nightmare scenario, one of the stories I wanted to talk about this week is there was a really interesting analysis done by Dave Wasserman, and I think a couple of other people have come out with similar findings, basically looking at the shift between the 2016 election and the 2020 election. And obviously the 2016 election, obviously Trump lost the popular vote by nearly 3 million votes, but still won the Electoral College because it's skewed in his favor. The demographic changes over the past few years that have taken place have mostly involved increasing population in strong Democratic states. So places like California and New York are growing their population, but not changing the tipping point states in any way that's helpful. So Texas's demographic is changing, but not so much that it's going to make a difference. The net result of which is that potentially, and I hate even saying these words, but potentially one thing that could happen, a not totally implausible outcome, is that Trump could win the presidency for a second term by losing the popular vote by up to 5 million votes. So that sucks.
Yeah, and that's that is the kind of nightmare scenario, and especially as the executive branch is responsible for the census, which is what ultimately decides these, especially in kind of House seats where you have these packing and cracking of districts, where the popular vote question is even more dramatic in Congress, where there are states where the Democrats won the popular vote almost overwhelmingly and still did not return as many representatives to Congress to nearly represent that kind of change. That said, I'm almost hopeful. So Texas is the really interesting kind of keystone with that, because the kind of moving from small towns to big cities is happening within the state. In terms of an actual presidential election, I wrote a piece back in 2013 about Texas voting demographics, looking at places like Houston, where at the time the public school system in Houston was something like 73% Hispanic. Every year that generation, another year of that generation gets of voting age. Every year a lot of the kind of elderly, usually more right-wing voters die off. So I think Beto O'Rourke, who I think has been quite a problematic presidential candidate, but his success in almost unseating Ted Cruz in the Texas Senate race shows that Texas, with the right kind of campaign, could be vulnerable in a way that I think means that the Republicans will have to put resources in it in a way that they wouldn't have had to in previous elections. But you're absolutely right. I mean, and there's a few things that could be done to absolutely fix American democracy, right? Statehood for DC and Puerto Rico.
Here.
Because, and lowering the voting age to 16, and a commission on districting and an accurate census, meaning that states return electoral college delegates in a way that's more representative of population, would make the American system much more fair, and pretty much mean there could never be, with the Republican Party the way it is now, there would never be a Republican Party president again, until the party quite drastically changed.
Yeah, my pet political reform is I want to see an increase in the number of representatives in the House. The Constitution always envisioned that the House would grow as the population grew, but sometime nearly a century ago, we stopped that and we kind of fixed in place the number of representatives at 365, and I think we should just basically go back to setting districts, more proportionally and just keep growing the size of the House.
Yeah, and that would mean pretty much entirely just more districts in cities,
Yeah, pretty much.
which would mean pretty much entirely more,
More
Democratic
Democratic voters.
representatives.
Yeah.
And it's the Republican Party and Mitch McConnell that are making these things kind of impossible.
Yeah. But anyway, so we've got an uphill battle to fight. And then on top of that, as you alluded to earlier, on top of our demographic disadvantage, we also have voter suppression, all kinds of other things happening. So I guess the key takeaway here is we need to shoot the moon because we have to try to win by a lot in order to win by a little.
Yeah, absolutely. No, this needs to be, and I think that the one political advantage of the candidate the Republicans chose to kind of exercise this takeover of the Republic is one who is so visibly awful that he really has a kind of galvanizing effect on democratic organizing. I think we saw that in the midterms, and hopefully we'll see that again in 2020.
Hopefully so. Although I have to say, I can't understand why we didn't find him galvanizing enough in 2016. I certainly expected things to be more or less as they are, and therefore was very motivated. But other people did not seem to feel as I do, as I did.
But also, and again, this is the big takeaway from the Mueller report. There was a systematic and extremely effective campaign by a foreign hostile power to sow discord in the elections. And I think the new X factor here is nobody knows what Facebook and other social media sites, how much that kind of ginormous paradigm shift in how people get their information, how much that's changed, and there weren't really any effective countermeasures in place for that.
Yeah. And to be fair, I think we still have a long way to go in terms of securing our democracy fully on those things. But I think there have been some changes, even to Facebook's platform, for example, which are all to the good. And I think, for example, there's a lot more political transparency now. We can see exactly which ads are being run. We're able to keep an eye on it better than we were back then. Not that that necessarily is going to solve our problem, but we have more tools now to resolve this in real time than we had in 2016. So I hope we do. Yeah. Okay. Thank you for that. Are you able to stick around for just a few minutes to play the gut check game?
Yeah, absolutely.
Fabulous. So for new listeners to the podcast, the gut check game is where I pull out of my trusty Red Sox baseball cap a randomly selected thing from the campaign trail. In this case, I have in my hat the names of all 24 candidates currently in the race. And what I'm going to ask Nicky to do is, in his role as editor, to imagine that the news that just broke is that this person has now been selected as the Democratic nominee, and ask him what story he would assign to his staff as editor. Right? So the first one I am randomly selecting. So the news that you have to assign out is that Pete Buttigieg has been selected as the nominee.
Oh, wow.
That'd be a story.
Yeah, that would be, and also I think not. I was wondering if you'd end up with one of the sort of 14 or 15 interchangeable elderly white.
Well, those may still come.
But yeah, those are much easier because it's who is John Hickenlooper as the general. Actually, I quite like John Hickenlooper, but in general, it's
President Hickenlooper has a nice ring to it.
It does, doesn't it? And it's worth. And I'm completely not answering the Buttigieg question for the moment, but yeah, I think Hickenlooper's done kind of a great job as governor of Colorado. But with Pete Buttigieg, I think by that point the question is what are his actual policies? Like we have over the last few months, and obviously, by this point in the campaign, perhaps this question has been answered already. I am much less certain with Pete Buttigieg um, than I am about his kind of temperament and personality than I am over exactly what a Pete Buttigieg legislative agenda would be. That's the question I'd want to send a writer off to try and figure out is, what's his healthcare plan look like? What's his education plan look like? What's his those kind of things. Yeah. That side of the question, I think, is to a certain extent about sending somebody to South Bend and looking through. And to be honest, that's now that I think about it, that's probably something that I could do at this point.
You could maybe go do that. Yeah. There you go.
But the other question, and obviously with any kind of domestic, someone whose previous political experience is as executive as the mayor of a small town, what's his foreign policy like? I mean, obviously he's a polyglot. He speaks a lot of languages. He's a
veteran.
Presumably be he's a veteran. He understands the kind of problems facing America overseas. But I don't, for example, know what what his policy would be with regards to Saudi Arabia, with regards to Russia. Does he believe in sanctions? Those, if I'm lucky enough, and I think we're probably not near the front of the queue by the time this happens, but those are the kind of questions I'd want to ask him in a sit-down interview. Is how are you going to face these foreign policy questions when you're up against people with the kind of diplomatic experience that some of the senators have.
I love that because that's a very serious and policy focused and kind of journalistic and interrogative approach to it. If I were an editor, I would probably go the easy route of just do the historic angle of first gay,
and that's,
youngest, all that.
Yeah, and it's that's also kind of important to mention that a lot of people. A lot of the criticism of Pete Buttigieg has been that he's, kind of a centrist, kind of white bread, but actually, that's a genuinely, truly historic moment in American history. It'd be the first, first non-baby boomer. No,
Obama wasn't a baby boomer.
Yeah. But
first millennial for sure.
It's the first millennial, yeah, and I think that's extremely interesting, and the first. First man of America also, and also
yeah. I mean, Chasten alone is a week's worth of great. Chasten, he's a great story.
Everyone's loving the kind of profiles of him. He just seems like a fantastic dude.
Whether or not he winds up in the White House, I just want to keep hanging out with him. So
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, they're very much the of the candidates. That's the interesting primary, and actually, it's important in American politics. It's a big question that always gets asked. This first came up in the George W. Bush Al Gore election? Which is the candidate you'd want to have a beer with? And for me, I think Pete and Chasten Buttigieg are very high on that list.
Gosh, yeah, and I keep saying I would want to have cocktails or wine with Kamala Harris on the back deck somewhere.
Absolutely.
She would be so fun. I think Pete and Kamala would be my two top choices for an alcoholic beverage.
I'm a big Warren.
I would love to hang out with Elizabeth Warren, but I'd want to have coffee with her so we can get really intense and have really detailed conversations because she's fascinating.
Yeah, well, there was an amazing moment on Twitter where I think she's a Daily Show correspondent, Ashley Nicole Back, said, does Elizabeth Warren have a plan for my love life? And Elizabeth Warren sent her a tweet saying, DM me, I've got a plan for this.
I saw that. That was hilarious.
That's so great.
It was awesome. And she actually did. They met and she had she had some advice. And the woman was really moved by it. It was wonderful.
Yeah.
I can't really see Bernie Sanders doing that.
No, absolutely no. Bernie Sanders, I think, awful. One I'd rather hang out. He'd just be oh God, just talking about the big banks.
Stop.
We get it. We get where you stand on the big banks.
I was joking to a friend of mine that if it was Bernie Sanders that I was offered to have a drink with, I would have tepid water because I feel like he would shout at me about whatever other choice I made.
Yeah.
It would be wrong.
Again, also worth saying, he's not wrong about the big banks, right?
He's totally right. I agree with him about so much. I just wish he would just stop shouting.
Yeah, and he's kind of a grump.
Yeah, that's what I mean. He's just kind of grumpy, and I'm not grumpy. I'm angry. That's a big difference.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
Should we do another name?
Yeah, let's do it.
The next name in my hat is actually exactly the kind of nondescript white man that you were talking about. So throw me your John Delaney story.
Excuse me while I briefly Google John Delaney.
Former Massachusetts Representative John Delaney.
I mean, I think, like every publication at that point, the first headline is going to have to be, "Who is John Delaney?" I mean, he's not someone without a reasonable policy slate. I actually think he got some good answers in the debate. But first of all, I think readers are going to want to know more about him at that point. He is not one of the better known candidates. So I'd want to send someone to kind of dig into his voting record in Congress to look at what we can kind of work out about what he actually believes. He's very good on questions of election security. It sounds like that was what he in the debate was talking a lot about. So how he plans to protect the electoral system and how he plans to conduct an election before he's in a position to do that, I think would be interesting. What kind of campaign do you run when you're campaigning against that kind of partisanship?
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, that would be an interesting angle. Like, you want to reform the system, but you have to exist. You have to operate in the current system. Yeah. How are you going to manage that, squaring that circle? That's actually a pretty good question for any candidate. You should go write that story.
I've given myself plenty of work to do.
There you go. I'm so helpful. My consultant fee. I'll send you the invoice. The next name I've pulled out of my hat is one that we've already mentioned a bunch of times on the podcast. So Elizabeth Warren is now the nominee. What's your first story you want to write?
Oh, I think my first headline is, "Oh, thank God."
Sheer relief washes over the nation.
Yeah. My question, I think the question that Elizabeth Warren is going to have to answer. Excuse me briefly if I start to get slightly distracted because a ginormous wasp has just flown in the window.
Oh my goodness! Well, are you okay?
No, it's fine. Hopefully, it'll go away.
Good luck.
How is she going to plan to reach out to the kind of voters who still think she is going to raise their taxes? That's the big question with Warren, is how, having fought a primary where you have to win over the base and you have to win over, excite the kind of people who love slogans like abolish ICE and tax the rich and all that kind of thing. How do you then and we talked about this earlier in the conversation, but how does she plan to make that pivot in order to win over the kind of skeptical small business owners in Ohio, in Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, and in the rest of the country? Like how does she plan to do that? That's the question with Warren. And it bears mentioning that one thing that did occur to me, I kind of gamed out who everyone's best beat pick would be, and it did strike me that for a lot of candidates, it's Sherrod Brown. Obviously, there's a Senate question there. For Warren, to me, the person to send to the Midwest and send this message that, like, we want to make your lives better. We want to, like, Medicare for all isn't about raising your taxes. It's about taking your employees' health insurance off your payroll and allowing you to increase the size of your business. And for me, it seemed a little bit like the person that Warren could quite effectively send as her vice presidential pick might be Pete Buttigieg. So that would be, I think, a very interesting ticket.
Interesting.
But yeah, what her strategy is for kind of while remaining true to her identity, widening her appeal to people who are worried that she'll raise their taxes is I think the big question over a Warren presidential candidacy.
Yeah. And of course, famously, she has stated, as a couple of other candidates has, that she, for example, won't do Fox News interviews, and which I completely understand her rationale for that. But I think the concern that raises is then completely understand.
And it's mentioning that yes, there's a whole generation of baby boomers who I saw a fantastic tweet the other day that said everything that our parents' generation, everything our grandparents' generation said that phones were going to do to us, Fox News has done to them.
Literally.
But I kind of think that constituency is lost. But network news reaches an unbelievably higher number of people than Fox News. It's a very specific, like in the same way that, she's not going to get the message across successfully by doing an interview with Breitbart. If anything she does on Fox News, and this happened to a couple of candidates that actually did do a Fox News town hall, is they then chop and change the footage to make them look foolish.
Yeah.
I just think it's silly to play along with their game. But that's not to say she doesn't need another strategy. And maybe it's just a barnstorming series of town halls at which she is just terrific in a town hall.
Yeah.
To take that message to people directly.
I think that's right. I think I've been encouraged to see the steadiness of her numbers growth. I've been encouraged to see how it doesn't feel like kind of one media hit and then she grows, but more kind of consistently on the back of a number of voter engagements. That feels to me like a campaign that's really growing from the ground up, which is what you want to see. It's a sign of good health. So
yeah, and the Warren has a plan for that.
She has a plan for that.
Kind of unofficial campaign slogan.
I totally want that T-shirt.
Yeah, me too.
Right. Should we do one last name? Final candidate is Beto O'Rourke.
That would very much surprise me. I've been holding on to the headline idea. Phony Beatomania has bitten the dust.
Yeah. So you'd have to revise that one.
I would be stunningly surprised if Beto O'Rourke isn't, if not soon to drop out, then not kind of long for this campaign. Beto O'Rourke, it seems like a really nice guy. He really disappointed me very early in the campaign when he did that disastrous Vanity Fair interview where he was asked the question. This is a question that anyone running for president really needs to have a good answer for.
Yeah, it's the baseline question.
Why he wants to be president. And he gave this answer that was something like, oh, I just felt like I was born for it. And you're just like, oh, God, that is just so the wrong, read the room, dude. Like, that is not the right answer for that. So I guess, if he does through some... and we live in the chaos universe, so it's not out of the question. But if he does become
this is the worst timeline.
Yeah, or at least certainly the dumbest timeline. But I think the question has to be, first of all, there's a lot of questions of his experience. He was one-term congressman. He does not have the legislative experience of, say, for example, John Delaney, right? Like he's
I would love that angle. Like, just if your whole angle was, the lesser John Delaney.
Yeah, but so the question is, how are you going to fix this? What are you actually about, other than vague promises of bipartisanship and bringing people together and these kind of slightly meaningless bromides? Like, what's a Beto O'Rourke policy? Should
Beto O'Rourke have run for Texas Senate for John Cornyn's seat again instead of running for the presidency?
Yeah, I agree. I think it was ego that he didn't.
Yeah. Unfortunately. Well.
Absolutely. And he could have and then a upset victory in Texas during a time when strong campaigning in Texas is going to be incredibly important. He could have been a fantastic presidential contender a little bit down the line, and I think he allowed his ego and his feeling of being part of this movement to drive him to make a mistake.
I also wonder to what extent people mistook. I mean, the enthusiasm for Beto in his Senate race was clearly real, but I also think there was some of it that was driven by an absolute loathing for Ted Cruz that made people put on rose-colored glasses and really just want to believe.
There was an awful lot of kind of pent-up Schadenfreude of people waiting for Ted Cruz to lose his seat and desperately wanting it to. And kind of projecting that onto the race. But as you say, I think Beto should have stuck around and run for Senate in the way that did Stacey Abrams register for the governor's race in Georgia?
She hasn't stepped into it yet. I don't think.
So
She's expressed an interest.
Stacey Abrams fan, and I think is made the right call in not putting her hat into the presidential race this time around.
Yeah.
Because
she's also said though that she won't run for Georgia Senate, which is one thing people hoped she might do. Nobody wants to be a senator.
Yeah, well, that was an interesting decision. I'm not sure why she made that decision. Possibly because she was holding on for the governor's race. Possibly because she hadn't made her mind up about the presidential race yet. But yeah, that one slightly baffled me.
But she didn't have to make a decision about the Senate. She could have just not said anything.
Yeah, that's true. And
she didn't have to come out and say explicitly, "I'm not doing this." She could have just waited and seen.
Yeah, I'm not sure what that was about.
I've heard another political theorist, again, I can't remember who it is, I'm not going to say because I'll point you in the wrong direction, but somebody was saying that we are seeing an increase in qualified candidates not wanting to run for Senate because of the perception that the Senate as a source of power has declined. And I don't know if that's a part of the effect. And people think, actually, I'm better off as a governor because I can actually deliver policy, whereas everything dies in the Senate.
Yeah, and certainly this particular Democratic field is incredibly full of senators, and extremely good ones. But yeah, there is something to be said for the idea that a governor makes a better presidential candidate than a senator, because a governor can be like, I've run especially of a big state like a California or a New York. Not that I think the governors of either are or should run, especially Cuomo, but. But yeah, they've run what is effectively a country at that point. They're sort of not unfamiliar with
a small country.
Yeah, or in the case of California,
a big country. Yeah.
The Californian economy is bigger than the United Kingdom's now.
Yeah, it's the 8th largest world economy all on its own. So
yeah,
there you go. But we don't have a California governor in the race, so never mind. Possibly the only person who's not in the race.
Yeah.
Right.
But yeah, that's my response to Beto winning the nomination. Kind of an oddball.
So, Nicky, thank you for that. I realize you've taken up quite a lot of your time, but I found that really interesting and enjoyable. So thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you so much for having me.
And that's it. As always, you can find me on Twitter at KarinJR. That's at KarinJR. Please do drop me a line if you have any questions or comments about the podcast. Or even better, if you are able to rate or review the podcast, it would be greatly appreciated in Apple Podcast or your podcast player of choice. If you can just hit the rating or drop me a review, it would be very much appreciated. It really does help users to find and discover the podcast. Meanwhile, if you are a U.S. voter, I really urge you to get out right now and make sure that you have registered to vote and or requested your absentee ballot. If you're an American back home, you can do that by going to vote.org. Or if you, like me, are an American expat living abroad, either in the UK or elsewhere, you can do that by going to www.votefromabroad.org. In the meantime, thanks very much. I will talk to you next week. Remember, new episodes are released every Friday, so I'll speak to you then.